encourage everybody to get up. And what struck me was that this person said that she had done very well with the TA reviews, and that makes me very nervous because that's like, you run a 100 meter and you think you're ready for a marathon. So the big thing you have to do is get a whole lot more under your belt. So I'm reluctant to have you do a TA review if it just makes you kind of comfortable with the questions that they've posed. And of course, these are very standard questions, but basically, I think the best thing to do at this point, or whenever you start studying, is to do, as I had said, to go through, remember the list here, I've just put the figures up, but if you start at the beginning and you check off those things, not just memorizing it, but kind of getting what the topic is. And we've had questions about them. So you should feel pretty comfortable, I hope, by doing that. That should be a good thing. If you have questions for me or for the TAs, pose them for sure. I mean, definitely you want them posed, particularly if there's anything that seems confusing. Now, the reason I'm going to start with the figures is because it is, well, I haven't worked out whether it'll be 60 questions or 70. I'm sort of leaning towards 70 because 70 means you have a lot more shots at different materials. So it tends to work pretty well. Last year the exam was 72 questions. I'm thinking around 70 maybe, and so it gives you less count per one you might miss, whatever, and more counts of ones that you could get right. So the figures, if you're not used to looking at the figures, then that's why I'm going through these now first, because sometimes I think, oh, it's very obvious what this is. But again, I've studied the material for a while, so it's not surprising that I would find it that way. So, but watching someone else try to figure out what's going on was very, very helpful for our discussion. Okay, do you have any questions at the moment? Anything you can think of? Okay, so do we have a few people? Okay, so let's go through the figures, figures 13.5, which is this, and I've done it. What I set up, you should have the one that you already had. This one over here on the left, the review sheet, and then the one that I put on Canvas is this one that I was creating yesterday. There's really not time to do this material when I'm in school, so I have to do it on my days off. So I did it yesterday. Okay, so, but it's, you of course have the one that has all the figures, all the, all the legends and everything in it. So this now I could ask you questions here. So we're gonna be a couple questions, and you should feel very comfortable in looking at all parts of this. So if you're asked a question about something like, when does between what two values does the aortic valve close, you're going to be able to tell me that by looking at this figure. So between what two does the aortic valve close? Of these ones at the top. The ones at the top, anybody? There's a little arrow here too that helps you with this. So the aortic valve closes when the ventricular pressure drops below the aortic pressure, and that causes the valves to shut. Okay, so you should sort of get used to being able to assess what's going on in different parts. So if I say, well, when is the second heart sound, you should be able to tell me that it is what place along this. Is it 2? Is it 3? Is it 4? Is it 5? Is it 6? When does the aortic valve shut? And how do you know? When did the second heart sound? When is the second heart sound? Sorry, aortic valve is between 3 and 4. And when is the second heart sound? It would be, I give you a choice from 2 to 7, it would be 4, right? Okay, so you need to go to toggle between the pressures, the pressures in the various places, atrial and ventricular, the volume changes that happen. So if I ask you about a volume change, when is the greatest volume in the ventricle? And I give you a choice between 3 and 7, you're going to tell me which. Anybody? Here's the volume. What causes this bump here in the ventricular volume? Anybody?
Atrial contraction.
Yeah, it's contracting, sending the blood right into the ventricle. So that's that last 20 to 30% of the end diastolic volume. So you would say 7. So again, so that's the kind of thing that you should be able to do. For some reason, I seem to like to ask a question, and I don't know why people have trouble with it. If I say, when does the beginning of atrial depolarization occur? In which of these segments up here does the beginning of atrial depolarization occur?
Six.
Very good. Yes. Sometimes people want to tell me 7 because they're looking at this contraction thing, but that's the contraction. So you have to look at the electrocardiogram. So, okay. So get used to, being able to look at it and, and answer a non, it's not a tricky question. It's just asking you about if you know what's going on in the cardiac cycle. Okay. So then figure 9.7 is this one. And you'll be asked one question on this, which is, and you just need to know that this is the normal cardiac cycle. And this is if you had the heart out and you were, artificially pumping, putting volume into it. So you add volume and you get 150 mLs and 200 mLs. So that would be out here. And then this is happening when it's diastolic. You don't have any contraction happening. And this curve here, the systolic pressure curve, is when you allow the ventricle to contract, and you see what is the strength of the pressure, right? Okay, so what ends phase 3? What ends phase 3?
The aortic valve closes.
Yes, very good. If I ask you, what is this number 4? What is this number 4 that's pointing to this arrow? What is that? What do you call that period?
Isovolumetric relaxation.
Excellent. Very good. So you just need to know. And sometimes people have trouble with this one. But look, what is changing? The pressure isn't changing really. It's tiny change, not huge, very tiny. So what is changing here? What's changing is you're filling. You go from 50, less than 50 mLs to over 100. Okay. So for some reason that seems to get trouble. So you just know that one. So that's it. I mean, it's not like I'm going to ask you any other things than that. Okay. So figure 422, you see, I put these all nicely, although I do have, this one, these little arrows here, I had to do this again. I didn't have a chance to. These are not, this little line here is not pertinent to the numbers that are being asked here. So I'd have to get that off if I asked you a question on it. So it was applying to something else that they were talking about. But the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6 are the things that I would ask you about. So I'm going to ask you about what's happening, say, in one of these phases. So let's see if there's any. So this is now someone who has a heart attack, a transmural heart attack. So it's a biggie, and it's a biggie and a baddie, and you know that because it has an elevated ST segment, and it also has a significant Q wave. So you're looking at, sort of a very serious, one. Okay. So now if I ask you, and then, of course, this is acute, subacute, and chronic. And the things come back to normal, most of them, all except one. One does not come back to normal after such a heart attack. And which one is that? Which one is that does not come back to normal?
The exaggerated Q.
Yeah, the exaggerated Q. Now I could ask you I could just show you the figure and ask you something, or I could ask you where something is. So this would be the chronic cases. It's showing that this hasn't gone away. So if I said, well, what doesn't go away? What doesn't go away in this particular setting? Okay, and then if I ask you something about the endocardial heart having an ischemic stress, and I wanted to ask whether where you would find that that ischemic stress on the endocardial muscle has fixed the repolarization, its repolarization. Where would you, which one of these numbers would you say it has is showing that it's that the endocardial repolarization has gone back to normal? Which one would be the one that you'd want to answer?
6.
That would be 6. And so we're looking at this repolarization and it's back up, right? You don't have the inverted T wave, right? Okay, so those are the kinds of things that I would ask. So which one is showing the elevated, which one is showing the injury current of 4, 5, and 6? Which one is showing injury current?
4.
Yes, because that's the ST segment elevation. So you should be able to equate ST segment elevation and injury current, okay? So, and, okay, that kind of does it. I could ask you something about why the Q wave is exaggerated. Is it that the septum is greater? I don't think I'm going to ask you that. I'm just going to say to you now that it's because the ventricular muscle opposite it is dead. That's that, and so it does not make this one smaller by its going in the opposite direction. So it's going in this direction, and the septal wave is going the other direction. And if this is not doing anything, then the septal wave is going to look large. It's not because it has more muscle mass, the septum. Okay, 426. Okay, now this one, I didn't realize that people were having trouble with it. I mean, I saw that a lot of people weren't getting it right, but I didn't know why until I talked to the person who didn't know how to do it. And so actually Dr. Egena has a nice description below, which you can read. He starts this is one way. I say, just look at it. And if you know that this thing here is going to be there, and this thing that says one large square is 0.2 seconds. So you multiply, if you have 5 of those, if you have 5, say, this is one easy way is look at, if you have 5, you're going to have 5 times 0.2 is going to give you 1 second a piece, and between each beat. So the R to R is going to be 5. That's this 5 here. And what would that rate be then? There's 1 second between the R's.
60 beats per minute.
60 beats a minute. So I'm going to ask you the ones that are kind of easy of this. So you'll just have a picture like this with this too, though. It'll have that. And then I'll ask you one of these, and I'm not going to ask you, you can actually get this one here. You have to do a little more work. Not really, but the way he said it's really kind of nice. In fact, he says, if you start with this one, so if you have 5 of these, that's 60 beats a minute. And if instead you have it every 1 square, that means it's going to be 5 times this one. So that's going to give you 300 beats a minute. So then if you just look down the line, if you now have, instead of 300 beats a minute, you have half of that because there are 2 of these, right? It's going to be 150 beats a minute. So, but and this, if you have 3, it's going to be 100 beats a minute. So you're dividing 300 beats a minute by the number of squares you have to pass before you get another R. Now, so it says, he actually mentioned this, the heart rate is equal to 300 beats per minute divided by the number of boxes between successive R rates. Okay, so that's down to, it says for lower heart rates than 50, I think he says, whatever. Okay, but anyway, you have to do something else. But anyway, but you can get it by looking at these and just going down. So this one, this one here is easy because it's 10 squares between, and so that's going to be half the amount of the 60 beats a minute. So okay, that's what I'm going to ask you. You're going to have this figure, and I'm going to ask you one of these, and I ask you, have you tell me. Okay, so figure 3, 36. Okay, the figure will be present, so you can cut that out. It is present, and let's move this over just a tad. Oh, come on. Okay. Okay. So, so I'm just going to show you this figure, and it doesn't have the labels, obviously. And so you're being asked to say which ones are which. So this would be what kind of a block here? Is it a first, second, or third degree AV block?
First degree.
It's a first degree because all the impulses make it through, but the PR interval is greater than usual. Okay, so it's slowed down. And you could get that with digoxin. That'll slow things down, right? And people have trouble answering that question about digoxin. Basically, it's well, what does the? It's going to be on the page before, but anyway, what does digoxin block? What does it block? Anybody?
Sodium.
It's an ATPase of a certain kind.
Sodium potassium pump.
It blocks the pump. It blocks the pump, and it causes a lot of the voltage sensitive sodium channels to be, well, look, let's put it this way. If it causes a not very much sodium pumped out, which means it doesn't have as great a tendency to go back in, it has an effect on calcium. So that has to do with its strength of contraction, but it also means that you don't have, that the whole thing is slowed down. So you have a lot of, you don't have the kind of normal resting potentials that you usually have. You have, basically it's a depolarization, and because you need the pumping to be able to get the normal polarization, and that means that a lot of the voltage sensitive sodium channels are going to be in the inactivated state. And so anyway, so if it's inactive, those are fast channels. If you get them inactivated, things slow down, let's put it that way. And it's an antiarrhythmic too. So it increases the force of contraction, but it's an antiarrhythmic, meaning that it'll tend to slow heart rate. So please remember that it does not speed up heart rate to have it. Okay, so so AV blocks, including Mobitz 1 and 2. And so of these two now, Mobitz 1 or 2, you can have it in the first degree, but for where is Mobitz 1 and where is Mobitz 2, and which is the one for digoxin? Is it A, B, C, or D? Anybody?
Mobitz 1 is B, Mobitz 2 is C, digoxin is for B.
Right. So that is an elongated interval, an elongated interval. So you have so the PR interval gets elongated, and then finally you get a dropped beat. So it has this kind of feature to it. And it's considered to be a second degree block, meaning that not all impulses go through. And then this one is the one that is more sporadic and more dangerous in the sense that it's some kind of structural or chemical problem with the with the heart, and so very often will result in a pacemaker. So and this one, what is this one? What is D? Anybody?
Third degree block, ventricular escape.
Ventricular escape, and the way you can tell it, because you can't actually, in a certain sense, unless you look at it for a while, you can't necessarily say that there is no relationship between the P waves and the QRSs. But the giveaway about it is this very long ventricular depolarization. Okay, so because it's being generated by this slower ventricular muscle. Okay, so now Uh, okay, so now these compensations. And I've drawn in here this something to be very helpful for this, where the arrows are to tell you which is doing what. So the question that is asked in this case is, what are the compensations that will bring you back to a normal stroke volume when you have had something that causes the pressure to rise a lot? So you have increased afterload, which is hypertension. So the pressure is higher, and that means that the arterial pressure, afterload, remember, is arterial pressure. So the arterial pressure is higher, and it means you can't get the blood out as well. So the load against which the heart has to pump has suddenly increased. So that's this going up like this. And then you have three possibilities of things that can compensate to bring you back to the normal stroke volume. So you're trying to get back to this normal stroke volume so that you have the normal cardiac output. So if you look at these, which of these is the one that has to do with hypertrophy of the ventricle? Anybody?
E?
Yes, indeed. And the way you can tell it is because when you have hypertrophy, remember, your wall is much stiffer. You have a lot more muscle mass there. It doesn't really fill as much in a way, and the pressure is higher at rest. So I can't really see that's not filling as much, but you see that the pressure is higher at rest. So this is, instead of the usual resting, now you've added more muscle mass, and this arrow goes up. So that actually helps you a little bit in terms of being able to empty, right? Because you're starting at a higher pressure. Okay. And then the other thing is you have more muscle mass, so you can contract harder. And that's this arrow here, okay? So, and then if I ask you Starling's law, which one would it be?
C.
It's going to be C. You can see you weren't able to get the blood out. That's what's the problem over here. You're not able to get the blood out. Where is it? It's in the ventricle. The ventricle stretches, the ventricle contracts harder, right? Closer to optimal sarcomere length. And then this one is, which is also fairly simultaneous with this one. It has a slight lag of a few seconds, is the sympathetic stimulation causing increased contractility of the heart at a given length. So it's not the same thing as Starling's law, which is a different length, closer to optimal sarcomere length. This saying, okay, I've just turned on the sympathetic system. You have some norepinephrine, and you're going to contract harder at any given length. And so that gives you here to here. Okay. And okay, so the next one is these that, I'm sorry, I'm just so sick of looking at. And it does look as if when I was making these originally, that it was like a drunken sailor or something. They're all off to the side. I don't know what happened, but anyway, I had to snip according to what was there. So I apologize for that. But anyway, at least they're all in one place, which was the purpose of this. Okay, so now this one, the things you have to be able to answer. So there are 3 questions on it. And again, that's because it's the most important principle in the circulation. And that is, so we start with one in which there is an instantaneous rise in pressure and an instantaneous measurement. So you just rise the pressure and you get an instantaneous measurement of blood flow. So this, if I ask you of these 3, the instantaneous, acute, or long-term, which of them is not autoregulatory?
The first one.
The first one. The system doesn't have a chance to do anything to counteract this increase in blood flow that it doesn't need. So it's just, you raise the pressure, you get more blood flow, and you do it non-linearly because remember, it not only operates via Ohm's law by increasing the pressure, cause you an increased Q, but it also is going to reduce the resistance because it's going to distend the vessels, right? So the peripheral resistance is lower, and so you get a nonlinear uptick. So, and then the acute one, remember, is that you raise the pressure over a few minutes going into the blood. So the blood is, you raise it over a few minutes and then you measure it. And now the system has a chance to do some autoregulation. And the autoregulation period that I'm talking place is between, a little under 100 or about 100 millimeters of mercury to around 200, something like that. It is not this part here. So just to make sure that everybody knows that this is simply the autoregulation mechanism can't manage when you have the pressure that high. It's saying, okay, if I put a garden hose into a blood vessel going into a muscle at a certain point when that pressure is so high, I just can't counteract it. So I can't do my autoregulatory thing. But in between this level here, it does pretty well. It's kind of amazing. So what does it do? If you have more pressure that is putting more blood into the tissue than you need, then the system will say, okay, the vasodilator substances get washed away more quickly by the increased blood flow. That means I'm going to have a constriction. And I also have more oxygen and nutrients, which means I can make more ATP, which means I can contract the smooth muscle, which I do. And so I'm going to vasoconstrict. And then the last one. And there's really only the three things, and you're going to get 3 questions on them. So just have these right. Don't be in the wrong direction with these. So, and then this one, this long-term one, it's pretty much related to what the tissue wants. And how does it do it? Well, if you have, you give it enough time. So this is now you raise the pressure over weeks. Then what happens is the system is saying, I have a lot of blood flow that I don't need, so I don't need to put any angiogenic factors out. The angiogenic factors out, remember, they come out because of what they suggest is low oxygen, but also low nutrients, saying, okay, we need to have those angiogenic factors out, and you need to make more blood vessels. This is the flip side of that. It says, okay, you have too much blood flow. We're going to cut it back by just not having blood vessels. And just remember that if you have a chronic condition, just to stand back from the topic, if you have a chronic condition, which you have high pressure like that, you should expect that that person does not have blood vessels in a whole lot of places where they should be, meaning you're going to have much less. If you drop that pressure really fast, you get an antihypertensive medication, that probably is not going to be real good for the tissues. Okay, so now, let's go down further. Okay, now this is the first one, and the reason I'm bringing this is because this gives people, there's some counterintuitive thing happening that causes people to get this wrong. So that's why I put this here. This isn't one you're going to be asked, but you need to know the principle here in order to get it right. So we're looking at, these are both venous return curves. That's all. We're not looking at the cardiac output curve for the moment. And you have to tell me which one, again, you're not going to be tested on this, but I need you to understand which one it's going to be, which is going to give you the most venous return, venodilation or venoconstriction?
Venoconstriction.
Venoconstriction. And it turns out, and which is going to give you the most venous return? Low volume, blood volume, or high blood volume. So hypervolemia or hypovolemia. Which one will give you the most?
Hypervolemia.
Hypervolemia. So you have a lot of blood, you're going to have more venous return, right? So which of these is going to be hypervolemia and venoconstriction? Which, A or B? A, right. So they are the same. As I'm saying, it seems counterintuitive, but it isn't. Saying if you have enough blood volume, you'll get blood back. If you constrict the veins, you'll squeeze the blood out of the veins where they're hanging around just waiting for something to happen. And now you're squeezing them and it gets back to the heart. Okay? So, and then if you go over here, remember that the arterial side is very different from the venous side in terms of the way it functions. So venoconstriction brings more blood back to the heart. Arteriolar vasodilation brings more blood back to the heart. So which of these is it going to be?
C.
It's going to be C. That is arteriolar vasodilation, which makes sense. Now you have to think about what the arterial side is doing versus what the venous side. So if you have some partially constricted arterioles and you vasodilate, that blood is going to be like opening a floodgate to the capillaries. If you open the floodgate to the capillaries, it's just going to end up at the venous system. If it ends up at the venous system, you're going to have it come back to the heart. Okay, so that's the idea. So if instead have arteriolar vasoconstriction, you will not have as much venous return. Okay, so now we go on to the ones that you would be asked. Why isn't this showing? It's little self. Oh, well, we don't need it right now anyway. So this is figure 813, which you're going to have. So you'll have, this will be one of the things you'll have in front of you. And so you're asked, this is now during exercise. And so what is happening? So we start by looking at the venous return curve. So you look at the A, B, and C. And again, they're just, it's artificial in the sense that, you know, the venous return curve and the sympathetic stimulation of the heart is going to be happening, you know, relatively, not completely, but it's not too far off in terms of timing, but he wants to break it down so you can look at things a little better. So you start with this cardiac output. Remember, this is the normal level, and you always want to go back to the normal level if you get kind of lost. You know, 5 liters per minute venous return, 5 liters per minute cardiac output, and 5 millimeters of mercury central venous pressure or right atrial pressure. And so the first thing that happens, you haven't really exercised yet. You go from A to B because you are anticipating exercise. The system is going to say, okay, now we're going to do vasodilation to skeletal muscle to get you some blood if you need it. And then the second one is, so that's A to B. And then B to C is when you start to exercise, then you're going to have locally controlled vasodilation of arterioles, you know, because you're now using the system. Okay, so that's going to ultimately, you know, again, depending on where you are, remember, where you actually are is the crossover between the venous return curve and the cardiac output curve. So the other thing that happens in exercise, of course, is the sympathetic turns on, and it's going to make you on a greater contractility. You're going to be, this is upward and to the left. The positive inotropic agents like norepinephrine will make you contract harder at a given length, whatever. And so here you're going to be on a different cardiac output curve. So this was a different, to C was a different venous return curve, and then the sympathetics kick in to make you contract harder. So you're going to ultimately have, if you were to ask what you would get to, it would be, up at this level, somewhat above, say maybe 12 and a half liters per minute. Okay, and now we go over here, and it turns out that some people have trouble with this one. It's very interesting. Again, you want to start with the normal, so you know where the normal is, so you know what's happening. So we haven't really done formally circulatory shock, but one way of looking at circulatory shock is the circulation is inadequate, and a simple way of thinking of it is, one big element is you lost blood. So if you lose blood, you have a hemorrhage, or so that's an easy way to think of it. But again, there can be different things that would cause circulatory shock. But for sure, the circulation is inadequate, and you're not going to have the kind of venous return that you normally have. So this is the normal, and the normal would be this kind of venous return, 5 liters per minute, right? And here you have much less. You're going to have it at this level here. So say 2.5 liters per minute. This isn't going to hold you. This is not enough, right? So, and the cardiogenic is saying, okay, instead of being on this normal cardiac output curve, you do not have the cardiac support. When I say something is cardiogenic shock, is because the heart itself is inadequate to pump well enough. So, okay, so you're on a different cardiac output curve. Okay, so circulatory shock, you're on the same cardiac output curve, but you're on a different, venous return curve. And the cardiogenic shock, you're on, the difference is the cardiac output curve is not good enough. Okay, and now you would be asked, not this one, not 817, but it's very good to show you 817 because it is different from 818 in a significant way, and that is that everything follows from the fact that here, this was when this fellow was had compensated heart failure. He had had a heart attack, so this was the heart attack that he had, and that caused that caused this venoconstriction and mobilization of fluids from the interstitium, and so it brings you over to more venous return because you have more fluid in the blood, and then his heart was able to help. So his heart helped because it was strong enough to do it. So it took him away. He did have some pulmonary edema, but not as much as he would have if he had stayed at this level of C, which is, it's not actually perfect on this drawing, but this would be considered to have, if you were asked what value this is, it looks like it's 25, a pulmonary wedge pressure of 25, but sort of be thinking, we know that he had significant pulmonary edema, so this should be drawn just a little bit higher up. But anyway, so that 27 milliliters of mercury, we say, this doesn't quite show it there, is what he had, but then his heart kicked in and took him up higher, and now he is able to be at least enough compensated, and we say compensated because he has 5 liters per minute that he's putting out of his heart. That says it's compensated. He doesn't have much cardiac reserve, but he can do that at least. Okay, does have some pulmonary edema, even with that. Okay, but over here, now he has the atrial fibrillation, and he can't. The heart can't do anything. So he didn't manage to get up onto this cardiac output curve in this case. He's just stuck here, and this is actually drawn a little better. You see that's over at the C is over at the 27 milliliters of mercury or higher, and so he has very significant pulmonary edema. He has a really hard time breathing, and the heart can't bring him back up onto a different cardiac output curve, but the kidneys are working okay, so they just keep retaining fluid in several ways. One is the heart isn't working well enough to make the kidneys excrete, so it's going to retain it, and the other is there's all these hormones that get put out that are also going to contribute to fluid retention. So it's just fluid retention, but in terms of his cardiac output, it wasn't able to get up to the normal level of 5 liters per minute. Okay, so he is decompensated. Okay, so now okay, so this is similar to a figure. I don't understand why I can't get this over into the place where it needs to be. I should be able to get, well, anyway, doesn't really matter, but usually there's a little space here. But anyway, okay, so this is now an action potential. This is the action potential. And then this is the ratio of conductances. And so if I ask you, let me ask you something about if you had an equilibrium potential for sodium that is 0, what part of the action potential is going to be affected most?
Would it be B?
Yeah, B, actually, you can't get anywhere if you have a 0. It's very hard to get anywhere. And then C is definitely, you're not going to have any overshoot. You can't get an overshoot at all. You could have, you could get to this 0 level. If you had the potassium inside and outside the same level, you get to 0. Doesn't going to happen in a living creature, but anyway, you could. So, and where is the one where the equilibrium potential, the conductance to potassium is greater than it is is much greater than it is at rest. Conductance is much greater than at rest.
E?
Yeah, it's actually not a very good question because you see, actually, it starts up here, but you don't see it. I think to say what is E called? If I asked you what the late hyperpolarization, you would say that. So, but actually, I can't really ask that question fairly because obviously, somewhere in here is where you're seeing the big rise in the equilibrium, in the conductance to, to potassium. So, but anyway, so I have to ask a careful question. But anyway, you should feel comfortable about F being what in terms of conductance? What is F? What conductance is that showing at?
Is it sodium conductance?
Yeah, it's sodium. Yeah, it's sodium, increase in sodium conductance that causes the depolarization. Okay, so just, you should be able to answer any question that have to do with these letters. Okay, so now this one over here, I'm going to move us all the way over here. Oh, look what happened. Okay, it's spread out. Okay, so this one, this is now, so you have these two compartments. It's the same question, but you can ask you can have it the setup to be one or the other that is positive of the compartments. Okay, so these are the same value. Any question I have, it would be the same values here, compartment X and compartment Y, and then what would vary is only what is, or also maybe exactly what question I would ask. But the idea is, do you understand why, if you stuck an electrode into this compartment, you would see a positive charge? So what could account for that? So you're being asked to account for the movement, the greater movement of one ion because of the conductance, the permeability of that ion, the membrane permeability of that ion, as opposed to the other one. So you stick your electrode in. You don't know which ion has greater permeability than any other, but you measure a positive charge. So what would allow you to do that? Well, first of all, what can we say about chloride? Can we say anything about chloride? It's 110 millimolar chloride on this side and 110 millimolar chloride on this side. So can you say anything about chloride?
There is no net movement.
Yeah, you're right. You won't know whether that no net movement has to do with the fact that the membrane is completely impermeable to chloride, or maybe it's completely permeable to chloride. You have no way of knowing because there's not going to be any net movement because there's no difference in the concentrations. Okay, so let's take the example that if the membrane is more permeable to potassium than it is to sodium, so we're just looking at the other two ions. Where does potassium go? It goes from the high concentration to the low concentration, so it'll go over here. So actually that explains it, right? If you had this in this direction, right? Does that make sense? That you measure a positive and the only thing it'll do, let's do the counter. Let's say if the membrane were more permeable to sodium than potassium, sodium would move from this compartment, the Y compartment, to the X, and the positive charge would be here, and this you would measure a negative charge with your electrode. Well, you don't measure that. And what if they were equally permeable and had the equal, it's called equal activity, meaning they move at the same speed? You wouldn't measure anything. Okay? Okay, so now what do we have? We have the length tension curve. Okay, so you have it. If I were to ask you, it's not marked, so you can't really say it, but which of these three curves, if it were marked, which of these three curves is the passive tension? Okay, let's call this A, this B, and this C. Which is passive tension? The resting tension. Anybody?
C.
It would be C. Yes, it's called the resting tension, or it's sometimes called the preload, or the passive tension. There's no, so that's what you would measure if you were to, you weren't stimulating the muscle, but instead you would have it at different, you do different experiments at different lengths, starting lengths, and they just measure what the tension is it would go up like this because you're stretching on something. So the example I give, if you were in the class together, I would have you grabbing your hand, the hand of your neighbor and pulling on it, and that's going to be the passive tension. So you would pull on it until people say, well, what happens up here? Well, what happens up there is you would pull the arm out of the socket if you were strong enough. So saying it just doesn't go any higher because it's tissue and it's going to not, can't resist everything. Okay, so now, so what is which is the active tension curve? We said C was the passive tension. So if this is, remember, this is A, this is B, I don't remember which is which. Anyway, let's say this is A and this is B. Which one of those two is the active tension curve?
Is it A?
No, it would be B. And the total, I should have said which, whether it's total tension or active tension. The total tension is going to be the active curve plus the passive, and it gives this number here. Why is this happening? Okay, well, it's 20 after, so we've had 50 minutes. So if you don't mind, we break for 10 and come back. Okay, thank you. Okay, so what am I going to do? I'm going to Okay. So, so the question here is, as I said, well, maybe I didn't, I forgot if I got to it all right, but if you look at the total tension, it is made up of the resting tension and the active tension. So you add those two together and you'll get the total tension curve, okay? So tell me on this figure, where is the optimal sarcomere length on figure 30? Where is the optimal sarcomere length? Is it 4? These are arbitrary units. A length of 4, a length of 2, a length of 5, a length of 6, a length of 7. Okay,
Seven and
6.
a half.
6 and a something. So a little bit above 6. Yes. So that's you saying this is the one where you have the most interaction between actin and myosin and some ability to move is the crux of it. And so here, is the muscle going to be too stretched to get that? Yes. So you're out here. You're not getting any. And then this one, they say that what's happening over here is that you have act one description of it. I think they make these things up. As I said, I could be wrong. Don't quote me. That the actin and actin is interfering with each other. So actin and actin interference is not going to allow contraction. Okay, so the next one is having to do with this figure over here. So it says that the fast versus slow muscle fibers, there are these 3 different muscles. Pick one on how they differ based on how they're used. So you have fast muscles, you have intermediate, they have some fast and some slow, metabolically and physically intermediate between the fast and the slow. So if I were to ask you, I would ask you about the chemistry of these. So you need to know what a fast muscle is like and what a slow muscle is like, and there's something intermediate. Okay, and so the fast muscle is ocular muscle is an example that actually was this one on this curve, and then the other one was a soleus, and then the middle one is the gastroc, somewhere in between. Okay, so what kinds of differences do you expect? So which one is going to have the most glycolytic enzymes and not much blood flow? It doesn't have a marker, but is it to the left or to the right? It has a lot of glycolytic enzymes. It has a lot of sarcoplasmic reticulum, and it doesn't have a high circulation.
Or it's the left?
It's the left, yes. And the muscle fibers are big. It seems very funny, right? Muscle fibers are big, and the nerves coming into them are also big. You see this, sometimes people get, the fact that this is a tight curve makes you think of that it's little. It's not. These are big and they're fast, and they don't rely on circulation. Do they have a lot of mitochondria of the types? Are they the
No.
No. Okay, so now we go to the other side. So this is going to be the ocular muscle, and you go over here, and this is now slow muscle, and you can tell it's slow because this is the force of contraction. It takes 80 milliseconds to get to the peak, whereas this one is very quick, right? So this one now is slow, and this is going to be very reliant on blood supply. So remember that these are red muscles. They call them red, and they're red for 3 reasons. They're red because they have a lot of circulation. They have a lot of blood supply. They're red because the myoglobin is red, and also the mitochondria are red. So those are the things that make it red rather than white muscle. So you call it dark meat, or as opposed to white meat or whatever. If it was something that you were using meat for. Okay, so and these are small fibers. These are small because you have to get the blood in and out. I mean, in other words, it requires this circulation to be able to do this, and they are slower because they're smaller. So sometimes people want to tell me something about, this is when we get to the AV block, not AV block, but the normal slowing at the AV node. People tell me that it's slow. There's a normal slowing there because the fibers are large and slow conducting. That doesn't work like that. Okay, if you have an excitable tissue that has a large fiber, it's going to tend to be fast. Okay, so now we're going to go up to what we had kind of gotten to last time. So we're going to go up this figure, up this to here, and we had gotten somewhere in here when we were doing review before. So we had gotten from the top of this sheet, the first sheet, down. So it's really on the second sheet down. We gotten to that level when we did the three-hour review before. So and somewhere in here was where we had gotten to. So what I'm going to do is there something for you to look at? Just a second. No, okay. So now I'm going to go to the lecture material. We'll get this over here. And let's see now. Put it over here a little bit. Just bear with me a second while I get it up to the level we need. Okay. And so we're going to go to well, I'm going to talk for a minute, and then we're going to get to page, where do we need to look? Well, page 21, I guess we'll go to. Okay. Okay, so meanwhile, while I'm getting to page 21, I'm going to talk about, we had gotten, I think, to the point where I was talking about the equilibrium potential. I think I did go through it very briefly. The big thing about the equilibrium potential, the two things that you need to know are that if you were to have the concentration in equal to the concentration out, if there's no difference, there's not going to be a non-zero equilibrium potential, because it is determined by the tendency for the ion to move in a net way. And if there's no tendency, then you will have no value for it. So, and the other thing about it that is important. So here's the equation. This is one example of it. So this is when it's been you take it out the natural log, and you get the log to the base 10, and you get this equilibrium potential minus 60 times the log of the concentration in over the concentration out. And I made an artificial one. This is for potassium, and basically this is going to give you a minus 60 millivolts inside negative for the potassium. So, and it's related to the charge on the ion, which is in case this is plus. Okay, so this is a minus. There's a minus sign here. But the big thing about it is if the outside were 135 and the inside is 135, the log of that is going to be 0, and there's not going to be any non-zero equilibrium potential. So there's not going to be any tendency for that ion to move. And the thing where it comes up in the other questions is, if you do something to make the difference across the membrane less, you're going to have a depolarization. I mean, you're going to go from whatever value this is, negative or positive, and take you closer to 0. So if the difference across it is less, you will take it closer to 0, whichever direction it was, it'll be closer to 0. And that is a depolarization. Depolarization means you're heading towards 0. So if you were doing it with sodium, so the concentration difference across the membrane for sodium was less, you would, it would be, it would be going towards 0. Okay, so that's really the big thing you should, so that's the that has to do with the concentration difference across the membrane. And then if you go to the next one over here, which is on page 16, which you can look at for yourself if you want, but it's really good to just do it here if you can. But you can go the pages are there for you to look at, the material behind it if you need to refresh it. But the big thing is this is now current flow. So current flow across the membrane needs to have non-zero of the conductance and non-zero of the difference between membrane potential and the equilibrium potential. So if you had the same membrane potential as the equilibrium potential, would you have any current flow for that ion? If you have the same membrane potential and equilibrium potential, would you have any current flow for that ion?
You wouldn't.
You would not, because by definition, the equilibrium potential, the definition of it is the membrane potential at which there is no net movement of the ion. So it's the energy in the concentration gradient is what it is. And if the membrane potential and the equilibrium potential are the same, that system is at equilibrium. I mean, it's not going to go anywhere. Okay. So there are two things that you need to have any current flow. You need to have this difference between the membrane potential and the equilibrium potential, and you need to have a conductance. And what is the physical thing one should be thinking about as conductance in terms of membranes that we know? What is it? Are the channels closed or open if you have a non-zero conductance?
They're open.
They're open. So it's a measure of the ability of an ion to move. So it's an open channel. So this is higher, you have a lot of open channels. So if all the channels are closed, it doesn't matter if you have a difference here that's great. If all the channels are closed, you're not going to have current flow to that ion. Okay, so I should be able to ask you those questions about that. You'd have to kind of know this equation to understand what it is. We already did figure 31, so I'm not going to do that again. Absolute and relative refractory period. Okay, I don't really need to refer to the picture, but you might want to. It's okay. I'm not going to. Oh well, I can actually. No, I'm not going to go. I'm not going to go back to it. Okay, so the picture of the action potential. When the, you know what? Maybe I will go back to it. Let me see if I can find it. It is on page. Just 1 second. Let's see where it is. Oh, it says page 20. Okay then. No, it isn't at the place where the picture is. Okay, no, so page 20, it's if you go to that particular place, which we might as well do, I guess. Here we go. Page 20. Well, here's the picture. So here's an easy way to do it if you like picture things. So the action potential, the relative refractory period is from the time you reach threshold. So you can't call it a refractory period of the action potential before that, because it is going to reach threshold and you're going to get an action potential. So the absolute refractory period is because at this point and up, you're opening the channels as fast as you can, and then you sort of start to somewhere along here, start to get the channels in closing and inactivated. So if you have sodium inactivation, so the two things are when in the rising phase, the channels are opening as fast as they can, and then they have to close, and they stay closed, and that's sodium inactivation. So those two things contribute to the absolute refractory period. And then somewhere down here, along here, we don't know exactly. They sort of give a figure somewhere in the repolarization phase. The fact that okay, here's the one I want you to remember. There's usually actually two things that contribute to it. You still have some sodium inactivation going on, but you have a and the other parts, so you have some, but some channels could open, and somewhere down here, you have some enough open that you could get another action potential if you had a very strong stimulus. And then but the other part of the relative refractory period that people tend to equate with it, which is fine if you know that part, and that is that the conductance to potassium is taking you farther away from threshold, because if you have potassium leaving, it is a hyperpolarizing activity, right? It's going to take you farther away from threshold. So it's harder to get to an action potential. You can get one, that's relative refractory period. So if you equate relative refractory period with an increase in potassium conductance, that is fine with me. Okay, so here now 21, velocity, conduction velocity is related to, there's a picture here, but it doesn't really, well, it's statements. So let's just do that. So if you go over here, so this gives these things here on page 20. And then if you go over here, just remember that I mean, this is something that you would know from another course. You haven't had, well, you probably have had it in histology, or maybe somewhere along the line you had it. But anyway, obviously, if you have unmyelinated fibers, they're going to be slow. And they're going to be slow because when you have myelinated fibers, you don't have to depolarize all along the membrane because it's insulated. You only have to depolarize at a place where there's a free sodium channel, and that would be at the nodes around VA. So basically, other places, you're moving along very quickly. And then the other part is whether you have a large diameter axon. So if you have a large diameter axon, you move very quickly. And if it's myelinated, you only have to depolarize. The slow part is depolarizing at that one place where you have a node of RAN VA. So, whereas if you're unmyelinated, you have to depolarize at every place and make another action potential, along the way. So it takes much longer. And of course, small fibers will also be slow because it is a physical thing that you have these hydrated ions inside the cell. And if they have to move through a very narrow place, then they will move more slowly than if they have a large place to move. Okay, so that's here. Okay, and so the question here is from what we had known before. If you have if you have MS, multiple sclerosis, what would that do to conduction velocity? What happens with MS? What happens to the myelin?
You demyelinate the neuron, so it goes up. The conduction speed decreases.
That's right. That's right. So you're going to have now some places you'll have relatively naked membrane, I guess is the way to think of it. Okay, and then this one, using the cord conductance equation, if you had an equilibrium potential to sodium equals 0, would you have an overshoot? No, because this is not going to contribute this. If you have this 0, then it doesn't matter what conductance there is. If there's no difference, that's what that means. There's no difference, then you're not going to get an overshoot. Okay, right? Okay, and clearly the conductance to potassium is at rest much greater than the conductance to sodium, and so you have much more of the equilibrium potential of potassium showing itself at that time. So it's much closer to the equilibrium potential of potassium. And the big thing is that people have trouble with is this question, which I will be asking you one of these questions. And this is now here. So look it over. I should be able to have you recognize that if you make it so that the equilibrium potential for potassium, for instance, is less because you affected the difference across the membrane so that there's less difference, it's going to take you closer to 0, right? It's going to be a depolarizing thing. If you make the difference across the membrane, and you could do it by increasing the concentration inside, or decreasing the concentration outside, right? To make it greater. And that means that you're going to have a greater tendency to move across the membrane. And so, it has a potential for being a hyperpolarizing effect. Another hyperpolarizing effect, of course, is opening channels. But if you just play with the equilibrium potential, then you should be able to reason in that direction. So increasing the conductance in the formula, that means you're going to be opening a channel. So for potassium, you're going to be opening a channel. That means potassium is going to leave, right? So that will be a hyperpolarizing effect. On the other hand, so what happens with the membrane potential, okay, is it would be hyperpolarizing. If you decrease the concentration difference for potassium, what happens to the membrane potential? It's going to be depolarizing because the equilibrium potential is less, so it's not contributing as much to the membrane potential. Okay, so feel comfortable with that, and I feel perfectly happy to be able to ask it anyway. So don't assume that you've seen the question before. Look at the real question that's there in front of you, and and determine whether it's affected the equilibrium potential and what that does, or whether it's conductance. Okay, so now we're going to go up to. No, we're not going to go up. We're going to go on to muscle because we didn't do that in review. Okay, and so go. Okay, so this next page, this is page 22, and it's worthwhile just going to that here. Okay, so I will ask you one question about the differences between these types of muscles. So, and I want to get this over. Okay, there we go. Okay, so remember all these three types of muscles all use actin and myosin. They all use calcium, yeah. So what do they not share? Well, you have two striated muscles, and they have a regular arrangement. Those are the skeletal muscle and also cardiac muscle. And cardiac muscle is additionally striated because it has these desmosomes between. So the striations happen additionally, that you have these things that are sort of holding the cardiac muscle together. Remember, it's pumping all the time, so there's a lot of stress on it. So you want to be able to hold it tight there. So that's part of that, and then also the gap junctions are there too. So you have this sometimes called the intercalated discs are between the muscle sarcomeres. So okay. So and now if you look at what needs the nerve, who needs the nerve? Only one of them needs the nerve. Which is it? Is it skeletal? Is it cardiac? Is it smooth muscle that needs the nerve?
Skeletal.
Skeletal. There is some necessity for smooth muscle, the kind that is that uses a nerve. So there's autonomic nerves that go into the smooth muscle. It's called multi-unit smooth muscle. They tend to be small. They tend to be these small individual fibers. They have a nerve that stimulates them. They tend to need to be stimulated. So there's certain places the different examples. Did I give all kinds of different examples here? I don't think I did that here. We don't really need all of that. So here I'm not actually talking about it, but anyway, so there are the silly what's it called? Isn't that funny? The lens, the control of the lens has smooth muscle attached to it. The name escapes me at the moment. I'm clearly not going to ask you it, but anyway, there are ones that require the nerve, and that is one of them, and these are multi-unit, and they're a little different than the other ones. The other ones are the visceral smooth muscle is like you think of the gut lining of solid organs. Is visceral smooth muscle, and it is very different. It does not need the nerve, uh, because it is going to be very responsive to a whole lot of things, including stretch and and hormones and other kinds of things. Also, the nerve can modulate it, but it isn't necessary for its action. So if you stretch the stomach, for instance, it will contract. So it will have smooth muscle without neural input. And if you stimulate one cell, you will stimulate a lot of other cells. So the idea is it's a coordinated action that doesn't require the nerve. And if you have cardiac muscle, all cardiac muscle also has an autorhythmic tendency, and again has also gap junctions between the cells, and so therefore you can have this autorhythmic thing. So when you talk about ventricular escape, we're talking about the ventricular muscle can work without the nerve activity. Okay, and ciliary muscle. It's a ciliary muscle that has the lens that uses a nerve. Okay. All right. So okay, and then I think that's pretty much covered this. Oh, there is one question that is not on this sheet that is being asked, and that is just a moment. Maybe it's mentioned in some other part of this. I can't remember now. Just a second. What was it that I wanted to? That is, and it's a question that I ask, and I feel it's fair to ask, but I can't remember what it is in the moment. Oh my goodness. Just give me a second, because it was something that I did want you to have. Oh, no, very important. Okay, maybe it's in another section. It is, yeah, it is in another section. So what is it that makes it so that cardiac muscle doesn't tetanize and skeletal muscle does. So skeletal muscle can tetanize. That is, you can have a summation of the contraction, and cardiac muscle doesn't do that. And there's a difference between those two sets of muscles that make the difference in that property. It's very important, and it has to do with the length of the refractory period. So, for instance, and also the length of time of the action potential itself. So of those two, skeletal muscle or cardiac muscle, which one has the long action potential and the long refractory period?
Cardiac muscle.
Cardiac muscle, yes. They're very slow. They have that plateau phase, and most of the time that the action potential is occurring in heart muscle, it is refractory, meaning you can't get another contraction occurring at that time. That's very important, so you don't have tetany, tetanic contraction, which would be deadly in heart muscle. If it just contracts, you can't, fill, can't do anything with it, right? It just would not work. Whereas with skeletal muscle, you want it to continue contracting, and you want to be able to get a stronger contraction. And so it's a very fast action potential, very fast refractory period. Okay, so let's see. Okay, so the muscle sequence. So it's not all on this page, but you should be, it's on some other pages in here. I don't know. You have to, anyway, it is something that I want you to have, and there's a question on it. All right, so now, what do we want to talk about? Okay, so the muscle sequence. Let's do the muscle sequence. And I just like you to feel pretty comfortable with this. It's all kind of on this page here. It's really kind of simple. And I don't know, it's as if sequencing things or something is is a mystery. So people will tell me very bizarre descriptions of where acetylcholine is coming from, and and what is the sequence. They get the action potential in the muscle at the wrong place. I don't know. In other words, here you have a nerve going into a muscle. The nerve needs to have exocytosis, right? You have to have exocytosis of the transmitter. So you have their in vesicles, and these have to make it to the to the membrane, and they have to be able to fuse with the membrane so they can release their acetylcholine. And there is something about an ion that is in the outside that needs to come in. So there are certain voltage sensitive channels that the action potential is generating. So don't think about them as voltage sensitive sodium channels, but they're also another kind of voltage sensitive channels here that allows some ion to come in and allow this fusion. What is it? What is the ion that you need?
Calcium.
Calcium. You need calcium from the outside that has to come in to be able to release the acetylcholine. Okay, and then you have the motor end plate, also known as a skeletal neuromuscular junction, and this is where the acetylcholine has an effect on the muscle membrane. So sometimes I know what the sequence is. Sometimes people want to tell me that acetylcholine is released from the muscle. Don't do that. Okay, acetylcholine comes from the nerve, right? Okay, and then is there an action potential here? No, there is no action potential here. You need to have the action potential going along the cell membrane, which requires the entry of some ion into this membrane to be able to cause a voltage sensitive. So an ion comes in and it'll cause other voltage sensitive channels to open. So what is one of the ions that's affected by the acetylcholine? An ion that comes in. What is it?
Sodium.
Sodium, right. People sometimes want to say it's calcium. No, it's sodium. And the other ion that is activated by this is potassium. And these are chemically sensitive channels. Chemically sensitive channel, not voltage sensitive channels. You don't get action potentials here. But potassium leaves, sodium comes in. It's a relative depolarization. It doesn't go to the state where you get an action potential from it. You just get a depolarization to about minus 17 millivolts, which is enough to get the rest of the membrane across in the cell membrane to be activated sequentially as the sodium moves from the end plate to the rest of the membrane. Okay, so it's both the acetylcholine opens the acetylcholine receptor channel to both sodium and potassium, and you get what's called the end plate potential. So that's an end plate potential. It's from chemically sensitive receptor, not voltage sensitive. And so then you get you get the action potential along the way. There is a picture in one of the figures that you have, figure packets that you have, that shows that sequence. Anyway, and then what happens is you have a prevention of the interaction between actin and myosin during the time that everything is at rest. So when you have the excitation of the membrane potential also excites the T tubules, and so you get a depolarization there, and that is going to have an effect on these excitation that travels through the T tubules, and then via this particular receptor, dihydropyridine receptor, to the sarcoplasmic reticulum, and then calcium is released from the sarcoplasmic reticulum via this other receptor, ryanodine receptor. And these are test substances, not at least in the case of the dihydropyridine, is not the actual substance. It actually inhibits the channel. So I don't know what the original one is. And ryanodine is something that allows the calcium to be released. Okay, and then what happens is the calcium has to bind to troponin C, or just sometimes I'll say it binds to troponin. So it binds to troponin, that allows the tropomyosin to be moved away from preventing actin from interacting with myosin. So it allows the interaction between actin and myosin, and then you can have the shortening, which is called the power stroke. And then you do need to have ATP present to allow the detachment of actin and myosin. So if you don't have enough of that, then you will have you can have rigor mortis. You can't detach; you get stuck at that level. Okay, so muscle sequence. Okay, end plate potential. I already did this. What ions move? Is the end plate potential voltage or chemically sensitive? It's chemically sensitive. What ions move are sodium and potassium in opposite directions, and there's no action potential there. That happens in other places. Okay, the neuromuscular junction. Okay, here's some substances, and there's one other one for you to add. Is I wrote it. Oh, I know. I wrote about outside calcium. So the neuromuscular junction, these things, how do they affect the transmission? So botulinum, what happens? What does botulinum do? Does it increase transmission of, at the neuromuscular junction, or decrease it? And how does it do anything? Do you remember from before?
Does it block release of acetylcholine?
Absolutely, it blocks release of all transmitters, but of course, at this point, we're looking at the peripheral effect, and so it's going to be acetylcholine, and then myasthenia. What is it? What does myasthenia do? What's the problem with myasthenia? Remember, it was
Autoimmune attack
yes,
against the receptors.
of a nicotinic acetylcholine receptor, the skeletal neuromuscular junction, and so you have you have fewer receptors to have a good contraction, and they have um, you know um, difficulty in strength and difficulty in transmission, really. And then acetylcholinesterase inhibitors, the reversible ones, can be beneficial in myasthenia because you have more acetylcholine out for a longer period of time before it is degraded. Curare is a reversible inhibitor of the nicotinic acetylcholine receptor at the skeletal neuromuscular junction. Okay, and we already did this. What allows tetanic protection of skeletal muscle and non-cardiac? It has to do with the length of time of the refractory period and the action potential altogether. Length tension curve, we did slow. So those were done in the figure. So just make sure you have that, because this gives the pagination, whereas that, I don't know if it did or didn't. Anyway, and then now this point, in skeletal muscle denervation, there's a sequence actually. So fasciculation let me ask you, there's fasciculation and fibrillation. They're both abnormal contractile things that happen in skeletal muscle. And when it's, losing its innervation. And which one of them requires the nerve, fasciculation or fibrillation? Do you remember? This is now skeletal muscle fibrillation, not heart muscle. It's different.
Fasciculation.
Yes, fasciculation requires the nerve. It happens when you have abnormal nerve impulses, so the nerve is still alive. So if you had a cut higher up, the axon would continue to work for a while, and you'll have some release, and but you'll have abnormal ones, and they will be why they're called fasciculation, because it's a much coarser contraction than fibrillation, because it's all the muscle fibers in a motor unit, because the nerve is sending these abnormal impulses and is stimulating every muscle in the motor unit. So if you were looking at the surface of the skin, you could see the movement. It's much coarser, whereas the fibrillation happens after the nerve has died, and now you have something that happens to the acetylcholine receptor metabolism. What happens? Do you have an increase or decrease in the number of acetylcholine receptors?
An increase.
An increase, and it's called an upregulation of the acetylcholine receptors, and it's a very important principle throughout many different chemical neural systems, because it's saying I need to keep things steady. And the best way to do that is to assure that if I'm not getting my normal stimulation, I will make my response to whatever stimulation I can get greater. So upregulation of the receptor. If, on the other hand, you had the example that I give, which is, so as I said, it's a very, very wide application in different systems. So if you had given um, too much cortisol, cortisol makes you have very high uh, blood glucose. So it's a way of actually having a certain kind of diabetes. We don't consider it. We think of it's a problem with the receptor for insulin, but it may start with the cortisol. So somebody has natural or even you're taking cortisol, it can have a bad effect on the receptors because insulin is going to they're going to have a lot of insulin coming out because the insulin, the high blood glucose, says, okay, that's a stimulus for insulin. So insulin is going to come out. You're going to try to get the blood glucose down, but you're not going to be successful at it because the cortisol is still working to keep the blood glucose up. So you can have hyperinsulinemia, and that would cause a downregulation of the insulin receptors. May do what? Wide application of the principle of the body. Too much cortisol may do what to insulin receptors? By what process? It'll reduce the number of insulin receptors, so downregulation of the receptors because you have so much insulin, and so downregulation of the receptors. That would be the process. Okay, and we kind of have come to we didn't need to do the smooth muscle. Okay, sorry. We need to do some smooth muscle. And we're going to get through, it looks like, everything that we didn't cover before from the other review session. So visceral versus multi-unit I mentioned. So visceral is the one that is like in the hollow organs. I said solid organs, hollow organs. And so the GI tract is a good example of it. And it has the gap junctions between the cells. It's so it has gap junctions between the cells, and cells will function as a functional syncytium, meaning if you stimulate one cell, you will get the others stimulated also via the gap junctions, electrical stimulation between the cells. And so a lot of things affect it. It doesn't have to have the nerve impulse. Neural tends to be modulatory in those settings. The multi-unit is the one that it functions as it's an individual fiber that is stimulated by a neuron. So it's different, and there are fewer instances of it, but tends to be again. The iris is one of those places, the ciliary muscles to the lens, and there's some other ones as well. Okay, so if I ask you which one has the gap junctions, it's going to be the visceral. Okay, and then we could go on to the pagination, but I don't think we actually need to. I can just say it, but maybe I'll get it up anyway, just so we have it here. There's a lot of talk here. Go. Oh, here are some piloerector. Yeah, okay, so I had a couple of them. But I forgot the piloerector muscles and also large blood vessels. And I don't know when it changes from large blood vessels to small blood vessels, where you have some other things that are not a multi-unit and large airways of the lungs. Again, I don't know the sequence of what happens after that. So, but anyway, so the contractile process. Remember, you're going to use actin and myosin in both cases. In all the cases, it's similar to skeletal muscle. You get an activation by calcium, and you use ATP. Also, their cyclic AMP can affect this, as is true with skeletal muscle. and it tends to be actually stronger, if anything, than skeletal muscle. In terms of the activation, calcium binds to calmodulin. Calmodulin is a storage place for calcium, and it binds to it, and that is going to activate this myosin light chain kinase. You activate the ATPase of the head, so it's a little different. You don't use the general statement about it is that although they do find some troponin in some smooth muscle, that it's usually calcium binding to calmodulin that causes activation, not troponin calcium interaction. So if I asked you which is going to be the one that's going to be used troponin, which is going to use calmodulin, the troponin is for the skeletal muscle and also heart muscle, and calcium is going to be calmodulin. The latch mechanism is here. I don't know what the mechanism is, but it's very nice that smooth muscle is very good at maintaining contraction without a lot of energy. So part of that has to do with the fact that the energy, everything is very slow. Everything's very slow, and so you don't need a lot of energy to do it. So it's good because things like blood vessels are partially contracted throughout the day and the night, and you don't want to expend a lot of energy to do that. And but the latch mechanism is something that it's nice to call it a latch, because just like a latch, once you've contracted it, it kind of stays that way. So it's saying you can have long periods of contraction with this latch mechanism, whatever the latch mechanism is. Okay, and then the shortening. Now, a smooth muscle can shorten a great deal. So for instance, if you have the bladder, it can be stretched, and it can also be shortened until you're going to empty the bladder, so you can make it very small. So they say that you can have it a third of the normal normal size of, or less, of like the resting level, whereas skeletal muscle goes down to about 3/4 of its original size. So it only shortens a little bit. So the shortening is very much greater in the smooth muscle, like in these organs. And then the other element, it has to do with stress relaxation over here. And people sometimes get that relatively confused. But here's the thing: if you stretch this smooth muscle, one of the things that happens, if you do it slowly enough, it will cause distension will cause a relaxation of the muscle. And the way to think about it is that it allows for accommodating different sizes in hollow organs. So if you have, again, the bladder, you want it to be able to hold the urine, and so you're going to have a stress relaxation. So it will accommodate the different sizes by rearranging the actin and myosin for a greater volume when you are filling, and then when it's going to empty, it'll do the opposite, but which is not a stress relaxation. So this is saying stretch will cause it will cause the actin and myosin to rearrange for whatever volume is in there. Okay, so and actually I think that's about it, because we did do everything the other time. I don't think there was anything more to talk about. We kind of covered everything in the other time we were together and had the review. So I'm basically done, unless people feel that they have an urgent need for the material that to be covered in a review, or maybe there's some specific questions that people can bring up, or some part that people would like to have me state again for the optional review that I hadn't written to. But if you look in the schedule, there's an optional captured review in 203. Not that matters to you, but it is immediate apparently when it's captured. That's why I'm doing it here rather than upstairs, is because it's not just the Zoom that comes, it's basically the capturing, and that's kind of instantaneous. So it is scheduled from sometime after the biochemistry final. It's scheduled from 12:30 apparently on for 3 hours, but it depends on when that biochem final ends. It would be kind of after that, I would say. You have lunch, and then if you wanted to come, but I would not plan on doing it unless there is some groundswell for doing it, because you do have it in the review sessions that we did, this one and the other one that was whatever day that was the last time we met. We had it. Okay, and I thank you so much. I hope you have a wonderful, relaxing evening. I hope you have a wonderful Thanksgiving if you celebrate that, and a little bit of time off. Okay,
Thank you so much.
take care. Thank you for coming.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.